The distress beacon had been silent for 11 hours before Rael Daro noticed the second signal hiding inside it. Not the beacon itself. The beacon was doing its job, sending a clean single-tone pulse across the wreckage of Draken Station. What was buried underneath that pulse was something else. Faint, biological, irregular, like something breathing in its sleep and struggling to do even that. Rael was a field medic for the Outer Worlds Emergency Relief Corps. He had been sent to Draken Station alone, with a scanner, a full medical bag, and orders to assess the damage after a plasma burst tore through the station's eastern ring 3 days ago. Nobody expected survivors. The station had been empty, officially. A diplomatic waypoint between the Dragon sovereign clans and the Conclave species, Draken Station had been closed for scheduled maintenance when the plasma event hit. He almost missed it. The signal was so weak that his scanner logged it as background radiation twice before he told the scanner to try again, with the sensitivity pushed to maximum. Then the number came up, 4 biosignatures, small, fatting. Rael did not stop to file a report. He followed the signal through 2 collapsed corridors, through a section where the ceiling had folded down like paper, through air that smelled of burned metal and something older, something that reminded him of deep forest after lightning. He climbed over a wall that used to be a floor. He squeezed through a gap that pulled a long tear in his jacket sleeve. He found them under 3 meters of fused debris in what the station schematics told him was a private creche chamber, sealed and reinforced. The reinforcement had saved them. The seal had cracked. The emergency pod inside the creche had broken open, and 4 small creatures were inside it, pressed together in a pile the way young animals press together when they have no one else. Dragon hatchlings. Rael had seen images in xenobiology files. He had read the descriptions. None of that had prepared him for the reality of 4 creatures this young, this small, this clearly not doing well. Their scales were pale and soft, the color of clouds before rain. 1 was moving slightly. 3 were not. The one that was moving had a cracked left horn, a deep burn along its right side, and enormous golden eyes that found Rael's face and stayed there. Rael opened his medical bag. His kit was designed for humanoid species. He had burn gel, saline solution, microfiltration tubing, pressure bandages, and a portable bioscan unit that was now telling him things he only partly understood. Dragon hatchling physiology had 2 respiratory pathways. Plasma burns had scarred the inner membrane of at least 2 of the 4. Their body temperature was dropping. They needed mineral-rich hydration at a concentration 3 times higher than human saline. They needed filtered air and warmth, and probably food he did not have. He had what he had. He started with the smallest one, a female barely moving, her breathing so shallow his scanner almost logged her as gone. He adjusted the saline concentration using the mineral tablets he carried for water purification in the field. He cut microfiltration tubing from his environmental suit and fashioned something that was almost, not quite, but almost a breathing assist. He taped it gently around her chest using medical wrap. She did not fight him. She did not have the strength. The one with the cracked horn watched every move. Rael worked through the rest of them. He kept the scanner running. He kept talking low and steady, not because they could understand him, but because silence felt wrong. He said things like, "Okay, this part might be cold and stay with me. And I know. 4 hours in, he got a fragmented signal through the station's damaged relay. A Dragon Sovereign patrol ship had picked up the beacon. A voice, deep and clipped, identified itself as Sovereign Cast Vorath of the warship Unbroken Dominion. It demanded a status report. Rael gave one. He explained what he had found, what he was doing, and what he did not have. There was a pause so long he checked the connection twice. Then Vorath said one word, "Continue." The line closed. Rael continued. By hour 6, all 4 hatchlings were stable, not well, not safe, but stable, breathing, warm. The smallest one had crawled across the debris floor on legs that barely worked and pressed herself against his leg. He went very still. Then slowly he put one hand on her back. Her scales pulsed faintly, a soft pale light moving under the surface like a slow heartbeat. His scanner told him this was called comfort glow, a hatchling response to safety. Through the cracked viewport above him, he could see the running lights of 3 ships entering range. One of them was very large. One of them was the largest thing he had ever seen in space. He looked at the smallest hatchling leaning against his knee, and then back at the ships, and he took a long breath. "Right," he said quietly. "Here we go." There is a silence that falls over a room when something happens that nobody has words for yet. Rail had felt it once before, years ago, when he pulled a child out of a collapsed mine after everyone had stopped expecting to find anyone alive. The crowd outside went completely quiet before they made any noise. It was the silence of people catching up to something their minds had not processed yet. The crash chamber had that same silence now, but larger. The boarding party had come through the main airlock. Sovereign cast Voreth first in dark ceremonial armor, 3 royal guards behind him in black and gold, 2 conclave observers in pale gray, and then, behind all of them, Dragon King Savar. Rail had learned who Savar was 1 hour before the ship docked. Voreth's advance message had been brief. The hatchlings belonged to the eldest of the 7 Dragon Kings, ruler of Draken Prime Clan, oldest living dragon sovereign in the galaxy. Savar's mate had not survived the plasma event. Rail had set the comm unit down, sat quietly for a moment, checked the hatchling's vitals, eaten half a ration bar, and waited. Savar was 14 meters of ancient dragon, his scales the deep charcoal black that dragon biology produced in grief, the way humans produce tears. He moved slowly through the damaged station, not because he was old, but because something that large moving quickly would have taken the walls with it. He stopped in the entrance of the crash chamber. The 4 hatchlings were asleep on a folded thermal sheet. The smallest one still wore the improvised breathing brace held together by medical wrap and wire from a broken scanner. The cracked-horn male was asleep on Rail's jacket. Rail was sitting cross-legged on the floor beside them, eating the other half of his ration bar, because he had not eaten in 9 hours and his hands had started shaking. He looked up, he did not run. He nodded, he said they had a rough night, so did I. Savar said nothing. He moved forward and lowered his head toward the hatchlings. Rail stayed still. Savar examined each one, his breath coming in long, slow pulls that made the thermal sheet flutter. Then the cracked-horn male woke up. He blinked at his father. He blinked the slow blink of a creature that has been awake in the world only a short time. Then he turned and looked at Rail. And he made a sound. Subsonic mostly. Rail felt it in his chest more than heard it. His scanner, still running on the floor beside him, logged it immediately. Distress comfort vocalization. Clutch bonding call. Directed at non-dragon humanoid subject. Rail did not know what that meant legally. He would find out soon. Every dragon in the chamber had gone so still they might have been carved from the walls. Voreth's translator was silent. The royal guards had stopped breathing. The 2 conclave observers were looking at each other with the expression of people watching a stone drop into still water and calculating how wide the rings will go. Savar raised his head and looked at Rail. Rail looked back. He was very tired. He had improvised medicine for 6 hours with the wrong tools for the patients he was treating. He had saline on his hands and a tear in his jacket. He did not feel like a historically significant moment. He felt like a man on a cold floor who needed sleep. Voreth said carefully, "Human, the sound that hatchling just made, do you know what it means?" "My scanner logged it," Rail said. "I have not read the entry." "It means he has recognized you as Clutch Guardian. Under Draken ancestral code, that recognition is legally binding and cannot be undone." Rail looked at the cracked-horn hatchling. The hatchling made the sound a second time. "Right," Rail said. He looked at Savar, the oldest Dragon King in the galaxy, 14 meters of grief and power and silence. His eyes were deep amber, the color of something that had been burning a very long time. Savar had said nothing since entering. He said nothing now, but he lowered his head very slightly, in a motion that Voreth would later describe in his official report as a gesture for which there was no modern equivalent, last recorded in Draken ancestral texts approximately 2,000 years prior. Rael, who knew none of this, nodded back in the simple way of someone who is too tired for ceremony. Outside, the four hatchlings slept on, their scales pulsing softly, pale and steady as the stars. Nobody had told Rael that the conclave ran on paperwork the way a fire ran on oxygen. Within 48 hours of the boarding, he had been interviewed 6 times, scanned twice, asked to provide a blood sample for xenobiological baseline records, given 3 different sets of temporary identification documents, and handed a 14-page summary of Draken ancestral law that he read once, and then set down because his brain refused to hold it. He was now in a small room aboard the Unbroken Dominion, with a cup of something warm that Voreth's crew had synthesized for him, which tasted approximately like tea if tea had grown up on a different planet and developed slightly different ideas about what flavor meant. He was reading page 7 of the legal summary. Page 7 was about the clutch bond. A conclave observer named Pell knocked and entered without waiting. Pell was a Marathi, which meant he was tall, thin, pale blue, and perpetually stressed in the specific way of someone who had dedicated their life to keeping complicated things orderly, and was now watching something very disorderly happen in real time. "The Dragon King wishes to speak with you," Pell said. "Now," Rael said. "He has been waiting," Pell said, in the tone of a person conveying that a king waiting for anything at all was itself a historically unusual event. Rael put down page 7 and followed Pell through corridors that were not built for human proportions and into a chamber that was. Someone had prepared it quickly, he guessed, because the ceiling was lower than the rest of the ship, and there was a chair at a table, and the table had a second surface at a height that might work for a being the size of Savar if Savar chose to lie down, which he had. He was stretched across the chamber floor with his head resting near the lower table, which put his eyes at approximately Rael's level when Rael sat down. It was, Rael realized, a deliberate arrangement. Someone had thought about how to make this conversation physically possible without one party being permanently tilted upward. Savar spoke first. He spoke in Old Draken, which sounded like grinding stone and deep water, and which Rael's personal translator rendered a few seconds later in a flat, neutral voice that seemed wholly inadequate for whatever the original had sounded like. "You kept my blood alive when the stars went dark," the translator said. "What do you ask in return?" Rael had been told this question was coming. Pell had briefed him on the way here. This was the formal opening of a life-debt acknowledgement under Draken ancestral code. The answer mattered. The answer would be recorded. He thought about it seriously. He was a field medic. He had been a field medic for 11 years. He had worked in 7 different outer ring systems, on stations and colony ships and small rocky planets where the nearest proper hospital was 3 days away at best. He had watched people die from injuries he could have treated if he had better equipment. He had watched aliens die from injuries he could have treated if he had known more about their biology. He had been trying to get the Conclave's cross-species medical database updated for 5 years. He had submitted 4 formal proposals. All 4 had been delayed, reviewed, sent to committee, and quietly set aside. He did not want money. He did not want a ship or a title or any of the other things that probably made sense to ask a Dragon King for. He wanted the thing he had always wanted, which was to be able to help people properly when they needed it. He talked for 4 minutes. He explained the database gaps. He explained the equipment shortfalls. He explained the proposals that had stalled. He explained what cross-species emergency medicine looked like when it worked and what it looked like when it did not, and the difference between those 2 outcomes measured in lives. He was not dramatic about it. He was just specific, because he always found specific more convincing than dramatic. When he stopped talking, the chamber was quiet. Savar had not moved. His amber eyes had stayed on Rael the entire time, and they stayed on him now. Then Savar turned his head, very slightly, toward Vorath, who was standing at the chamber entrance. He said one thing. The translator gave it in Galactic Standard, slow and clear. Give him what he asked for, and more. Vorath placed a closed fist against his chest armor, which Rael had learned was a formal acknowledgement gesture. He left the chamber. Pell, behind him, was already on his comm unit. Rael sat with the Dragon King in the quiet room. After a moment, Savar made a sound that was not words. It was lower than speech, and it did not go through the translator, and Rael's scanner was not running, so he had no data on it. But it reminded him strangely of the sound the cracked horn hatchling had made. Not the same. Older. Worn smooth by time. Rael did not say anything. He just sat there, across the small table, in the room someone had made small enough for him on purpose, and he let the silence be what it was. Outside, the unbroken Dominion held its course through open space, and somewhere in the medical bay, 4 small hatchlings were sleeping under warm lights, their scales glowing softly, pale and steady as the stars. 3 months is a long time to live inside a warship that was not built for you. Rael had learned where all the low doorways were. He had learned which members of Savar's crew would nod at him in the corridor, and which ones would look at the wall instead. He had learned that the food synthesizer on Deck 4, if he entered the request in Draken script rather than standard, produced something close enough to real bread that he could stop thinking about it. He had learned that the cracked horn hatchling, whose formal name translated roughly as Shard of the First Storm, would scratch at his door at roughly the same time every morning, and that ignoring this did not work. He had also, quietly, been doing the best work of his life. The Dragon's sovereign medical archives were extraordinary. Not just large, though they were that. They were old and thorough in ways that modern conclave databases were not, because the Dragons had been collecting biological records for 10,000 years and had never deleted anything. Rael had access to physiological data on species the Conclave had only made contact with in the last century. He had case records, treatment outcomes, surgical records in old scripts that required translation before he could read them. He worked 12 hours a day and did not feel it. The hatchlings visited every afternoon. Storm was the most persistent. He had learned to open Rael's door by pressing the release panel with his snout, which he had figured out on his own in the second week, and which no one had thought to teach him. The smallest female, light between scales, had learned to climb onto Rael's desk and sit on whatever he was currently reading. He called her Moat because she was small and always in his light. Storm he called Storm because the formal name was too large for daily use, and Storm did not seem to mind. The other 2 he called Brace and Flicker. The court observers, who were always watching and always filing reports, logged the nicknames and described them as either an endearing cross-cultural irregularity or a troubling signal of inappropriate familiarity, depending on who was writing. The pure scale did not care about nicknames. They cared about symbols. The pure scale was the faction that had destroyed Draken Station. Rael had learned this piece by piece, from Pell, from overheard conversations, from the carefully edited briefings Vorath gave him once a week. The pure scale believed the conclave was a contamination, that dragon sovereigns who participated in multi-species governance were weakening something ancient and pure. Savar, who had been one of the strongest voices for conclave cooperation, was their particular target. When the station was destroyed, the pure scale had intended to kill the hatchlings and blame it on a conclave equipment failure. Instead, the hatchlings had survived, bonded to a human, and become the center of a political story that made the pure scale look like exactly what they were: people who had tried to murder children for ideology and failed. They needed to change the story. They began distributing claims that the clutch bond was false, that Rail had used some form of chemical or technological interference to trigger a false bonding response in the hatchlings, that the whole situation was a conclave intelligence operation designed to humiliate dragon sovereignty. The claims were specific enough to sound credible to anyone who wanted to believe them. Some people wanted to believe them. A senior court official named Dresh brought the formal challenge to Savar's court on a gray morning when Rail was in the archive, and did not find out until Voreth came to get him. Dresh was old and sharp, and spoke with the precision of someone who had spent decades finding the exact mechanism in any legal system that would do what he needed. He filed for a verification trial. Voreth explained this to Rail in the corridor outside the archive room. A verification trial was an ancient process, used to examine the validity of a guardian claim when that claim was disputed. It had, Voreth noted carefully, never been applied to a non-dragon guardian before. The rules of evidence were based on dragon physiological and behavioral standards. Whether those rules could be fairly applied to a human was itself one of the things the trial would have to decide. If the trial ruled against Rail, the clutch bond would be legally voided. Rail would be removed from the hatchlings' lives permanently. Rail stood in the corridor and took this in. "What evidence can I bring?" he asked. "Your records," Voreth said. "Your medical records from the station, any testimony from those present." Rail nodded. He had kept records. He kept records the way other people kept breathing, automatically and without thinking about it. Every decision he had made in that creche chamber, every adjustment, every reading from the bioscan unit, logged and time-stamped. "When?" he asked. 12 days, Voreth said. "And where?" Voreth was quiet for a moment. "The trial has attracted attention beyond this ship, Rail. All 7 Dragon Kings have invoked their right to be present for a ruling that touches on Draken ancestral code." Rail looked at him, "All 7. "And their courts," Voreth said. "Right," Rail said. He went back into the archive. He had work to finish. And in 12 days, apparently, he was going to stand in front of the entire dragon sovereign ruling structure and explain what he had done in a ruined station with no dragon-specific equipment and 4 dying hatchlings and the most basic instinct a medic has, which is simply this: you do not stand there. You do something. You try. He sat down at his desk. Moat was already sitting on his notes. He lifted her gently, moved the notes, and got back to work. The hall where the trial was held had no name in any language Rail could read. It was simply called the First Chamber, and it was old enough that the stone of the walls, if you called it stone, had absorbed 10,000 years of sound and sat with it. Rail stood at the center. He was wearing his field corps uniform, clean, with the OWEAC patch on the shoulder, and his name above the chest pocket in letters small enough that nobody in this room could probably read them. He was carrying his medical bag because Voreth had said it was wise, and Rail had decided to simply trust Voreth on this point. Around him, on elevated platforms that circled the chamber in concentric rings, were the courts of 7 Dragon Kings. Hundreds of dragons, all sizes, all clan marks, all watching the human standing in the center of the floor. The sound of that many large beings breathing was a kind of weather. The 7 kings sat at the highest ring. Savar was at the far end. He had not looked at Rail since the proceedings began. Rail did not take this personally. Savar was many things, and one of them was someone who understood when not to signal where his sympathies lay. Dresh made his argument first. He was precise, and he was effective. He described the clutch bond as physiologically implausible under circumstances of extreme hatchling trauma. He cited 3 historical cases in which false bond responses had been triggered by chemical exposure. He argued that Rail, as a xenobiologist with access to dragon hatchling biological data, would have known exactly which stimuli could produce the distress comfort vocalization artificially, and had the materials to do so. He did not shout. He did not need to. The architecture of his argument was clean, and each piece fit neatly against the next. Voreth testified. He described the communication he had received from Rael during the night at the station, the sequence of events, the condition of the chamber when the boarding party arrived. He was measured and factual. Pell testified, with visible reluctance at being placed between the Pure Scales legal team and a hall full of dragon royalty, and described the Conclave's own sensor logs from the rescue approach, which showed no chemical release events in or around the Kresh chamber. Then Rael's medical records were entered, all of them, every log entry from the moment he found the hatchlings to the moment the boarding party arrived. The trial arbiters, 3 senior dragons of neutral clan affiliation, examined them for a long time, long enough that Rael had time to study the walls of the chamber and think about the people who had stood here before him. Then one of the arbiters said, "We will hear from the hatchlings." There was a movement at the far entrance. The royal guard stood aside. Storm came in first, walking with the particular deliberate quality of a young creature trying to look like it has a plan. He was bigger than he had been 3 months ago. His cracked horn had healed slightly, the edges smoothing. His scales had deepened from pale cloud color to something closer to silver. He walked into the first chamber, in front of 7 dragon kings and all their courts, and he looked around. He found Rael. He walked across the chamber floor, past the arbiter's platform, past Dresh's legal team, past the neutral observers, and he stopped in front of Rael and pressed his snout against Rael's hand. He made the sound, the distress comfort vocalization, the clutch bond call, clear and unmistakable in the first chamber, with every sensor in the room recording it. The chamber did not react loudly. It did the opposite. It became the deepest silence Rael had ever sat inside, not the silence of people waiting to speak, the silence of people who have just watched something happen that reorganizes whatever they thought they knew. Then the entrance moved again, and Moat came through. She had not been authorized to be in the chamber. She had apparently followed Storm through the entrance before the guards registered what was happening. She crossed the floor in that wobbly, determined way she had, and she climbed onto Rael's boot. He looked down at her. He steadied her with one hand, the way he always did, because she had never quite sorted out her balance on flat surfaces and tended to list to the left. He looked up. 7 Dragon Kings looked back at him, hundreds of court members in their rings. Dresh, whose precise legal architecture was sitting very quietly now and doing nothing useful. The arbiters who had stopped writing. Savar, at the end of the highest ring, was looking at Rael for the first time since the proceedings began. One of the arbiters said, in a voice that had the careful quality of someone choosing words that will be recorded forever, "The chamber will deliberate." Rael waited. He stood in the center of the first chamber, 10,000 years of dragon history in the walls around him, with Storm at his side and Moat on his boot, and he waited the way he always waited when there was nothing left to do but let the outcome come. He had done what he could. He always had. That was, in the end, the whole of his defense and the whole of his life. The deliberation took 9 minutes. 9 minutes for something that had never happened before, in a legal tradition older than most human civilizations. 9 minutes in the first chamber, with the breathing of hundreds filling the air like slow tide. Then the lead arbiter stood and began to speak. The ruling took longer to read than it took to make. Rael stood through it. He had learned in the months on Savar's ship that dragon formal proceedings required stillness, and he was good at stillness when the situation called for it. Moat had eventually climbed off his boot and pressed herself against his leg instead, which was warmer and more stable. Storm stood on his other side. Rael kept one hand lightly resting on Storm's back, and Storm's scales pulsed once slowly in the pale comfort glow. The lead arbiter read the ruling in Old Draken first, then in Galactic Standard. The clutch bond was valid. The evidence of tampering was insufficient. The guardian of the clutch stood. These were the legal conclusions and they mattered, but they were not the part that changed things. The part that changed things was what happened after. Savar rose. When a Dragon King rose in the first chamber, everything else stopped. That was not a rule written anywhere. It was simply the physical reality of what happened when something that large decided to stand. He spoke in Old Draken. The translation came through Rael's personal unit in the flat, neutral voice that was never adequate for what was being said. But this time, Rael barely heard the translation anyway, because he was watching Savar's face, and Savar was looking directly at him in a way that did not need translating. The formal translation which Pell gave him in writing afterward read, "By the accord of worthy hands which has not been invoked in the recorded history of the Conclave era, Rael Darrow is recognized as named ally of Draken Prime clan, blood friend of the royal clutch, and holder of clan shelter for all his natural years. Any hand raised against him is a hand raised against the clan. This is spoken, this is sealed, this is permanent." The accord of worthy hands. Rael had not known about the accord. Nobody in his immediate orbit had mentioned it as a possibility, perhaps because nobody had thought it was a possibility. Pell told him later, in the small gray room where Pell delivered difficult information as gently as someone of his nature could manage, that the accord was so old that most dragon scholars had classified it as historical curiosity rather than active law. It had been written for a specific circumstance. A non-dragon who preserved dragon royal lives at personal cost, without obligation, without benefit, and without being asked. "It means," Pell said carefully, "that you are protected by Draken Prime clan permanently. It means the pure scale cannot touch you. It means their entire claim that you were a conclave operative is now legally and politically dead. Because if you were a conclave operative, Savar would not have invoked the accord. And Savar invoking the accord is the most serious personal endorsement a Dragon King can extend to anyone." "Right," Rael said. "It also means," Pell continued, "that you will be receiving communications from every political body in the outer spiral for the foreseeable future, because what happened today has implications for human-dragon relations that will take years to fully understand." "That's their job," Rael said. "I have work to do." He went back to the archive. 6 months later, the cross-species emergency medical accord was ratified by the conclave. Full dragon sovereign backing, Savar's clan leading the signatures, the other 6 kings following within a week. Every major conclave species signed within 3 months. The xenobiological database Rael had been asking about for 5 years was rebuilt from the ground up using the Dragon Sovereign Archives as the foundation. The cross-species emergency protocols he had drafted in 2 field proposals that had sat in committee rooms gathering nothing were adopted as standard conclave medical procedure. Rael went back to field work. He had a proper kit now. He had a staff. He had a title he did not use in conversation, but that made the supply requisition process significantly faster. He traveled the outer systems the same way he always had, going where the need was, doing what needed doing. He visited the hatchlings 4 times a year. Storm was growing fast, already half again the size he had been at the trial, his silver scales deepening toward the dark of adulthood. He still scratched at Rael's door every morning when Rael was aboard the eternal threshold. Moat had developed a habit of sitting on Rael's shoulder when she was small enough to manage it, which would not be much longer. Brace had become fascinated by Rael's medical equipment and had broken 3 scanner units through enthusiastic investigation. Flicker was quiet and watchful, and sometimes Rael found her just looking at him with steady eyes, the way Savar sometimes looked at him, like she was reading something he had not written down. On the day the accord was signed, a message came through on Rael's personal unit. It was from Savar. It was short. It was in Old Draken, and Rael had learned enough by now to read it himself slowly, with a dictionary open beside him. It said, "A human sat in the dark with our injured young and did not count the cost. We have not forgotten. We will not forget." Rail read it twice. He saved it. He set his comm unit down on the desk and looked out the port window at the stars, which were the same stars they had always been, cold and steady and indifferent to everything that happened between them. Then he picked up his bag, checked his kit, and went to see who needed help. That was all. That was the whole of it. That was enough.